The city had been dead for 9 months. Not destroyed, not in the way you imagine when someone says a city is lost. The buildings still stood. The streets still ran straight between them, but the windows were black and frost-cracked, and the wind that moved between the structures moved like something alive, deliberately cold, searching for anything left to kill. Snow had come early this year. It lay half a meter deep on the avenues and deeper in the alleys. Unmarked and perfectly white in the places where no one had walked, and gray and compacted in the places where something had. Corporal Nora Callahan lay flat on the roof of a collapsed hardware store, her body temperature deliberately lowered through 3 hours of stillness, her cheek against the rifle's stock, her breath when she allowed herself to breathe at all, a controlled exhale through her nose, never through her mouth, never a cloud of vapor to betray her position. 40 meters below and across the intersection, there was nothing. A corner, a wall, a faded advertisement for a restaurant that no longer existed. She aimed at it anyway. Sergeant Dale Hoffman had been watching her for 2 minutes from his position 3 meters back. He was 41 years old and had been doing this longer than some of their squad members had been alive. He had survived 2 deployments, 1 ambush, and a building collapse. He did not believe in luck, in intuition, or in the supernatural sensitivity some people claimed snipers developed after years behind a scope. He believed in observable data, in confirmed targets, in fire discipline. Callahan. His voice came flat through the earpiece. There's nothing there. She didn't answer. Command is calling for regroup. We need to move. Beside him, Private First Class Owen Gentry lowered his own scope and exhaled through his teeth. He was 22, and he'd been in country for 7 weeks, and he had the particular expression that young soldiers wore when they wanted to laugh but knew they probably shouldn't. He looked at Hoffman. Hoffman shook his head, very slightly. On the roof below, Nora Callahan did not move. Her finger was along the trigger guard, not on it. She was patient about that, and her eye was steady on a point in space 3 inches to the left of the corner's edge. Not the corner itself, not the open street, a specific, calculated point in empty air. 3 more seconds, she said. Barely a whisper. Gentry definitely wanted to laugh now. The wind shifted. It was not dramatic, a weather event, so minor it would not have registered on any instrument, a slight pressure differential caused by the temperature gradient between the sunlit south wall and the shadowed north face of the building across the street. But Nora felt it in the fine hairs along her jaw, felt the way it changed the weight of the air above her scope. The snow on the corner's ledge moved, not drifted, moved, a tremor transmitted through a medium that should not have conducted it. She breathed out. She squeezed. The rifle made it sound a compressed, flat report swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the snow, and then, half a second later, a figure came around that corner moving fast, momentum already committed, appearing in exactly the space she had been looking at, and the round was already there, and the figure collapsed without ever understanding what had happened. No one spoke for 3 seconds. Owen Gentry was not laughing anymore. The dead city. They had entered Veltmar from the Eastern Industrial Corridor at 0340 hours, 4 soldiers in a column, moving at the pace of a very careful funeral procession. The mission brief was reconnaissance only confirmed suspected enemy movement along the northern supply route, gather visual and acoustic intelligence, extract before first light. No contact if avoidable. Return with data. Sergeant Dale Hoffman led the column. Specialist Marcus Webb held the center with his electronic equipment. Private First Class Owen Gentry was rear security, and Corporal Nora Callahan, attached from the division's long-range precision element, which was the Army's way of saying she was a sniper and therefore somewhat temporary and somewhat tolerated, walked second, just behind Hoffman. Veltmar had been a manufacturing city, industrial, a place where things were made and shipped, where the population worked shifts and slept at shift's end, and did not think much about the view from their windows because the view was mostly other factories. 9 months ago it had been evacuated in 72 hours. The people had taken what they could carry, the machines they'd left behind. Walking its streets now was like walking through a museum exhibit about a civilization that hadn't finished dying. Conveyor belts frozen at mid-cycle, a loading dock with a truck still backed against it, its cargo never delivered, a canteen in a processing plant where the chairs had been stacked as though someone expected to need them again. Nora noticed these things and cataloged them without sentimentality. She was 26 years old, and had been selected for precision work because she processed spatial information differently than most people, not better, necessarily, but with a specificity that training had sharpened into something useful. She noticed the chairs were stacked. and she noticed that whoever stacked them had taken the time to do it properly. With the seats nested, which meant they'd been calm enough when they left to think about it. She noticed the truck at the loading dock and noted that its engine hatch was half an inch open, which could mean nothing and could mean someone had been inside it recently. She cataloged these things and kept them available but didn't yet draw conclusions. Nora had grown up in a small town in northern Minnesota, the kind of place where the lake froze solid from November to March, and the first snowfall was not a weather event but a transformation of the entire epistemology of landscape. Her grandfather had been a hunter, and he had taught her what he knew, which was not shooting, primarily, but reading. He would take her out before dawn, when the snow was fresh and untracked, and teach her to read it the way he read it as a text, fully written, in a language that required patience to learn but was, once learned, extraordinarily precise. She had grown past what her grandfather had taught her. She had been trained by people who had formalized intuition into method, who had translated the hunter's instinctive spatial reading into a technical discipline with named practices and measurable outcomes. But the foundation was his. She thought about him sometimes in moments like this one, moving through snow-covered silence, and wondered if he had any idea what he'd started. The snow was the other thing. It had been falling intermittently for 3 days, and it covered the city in an irregular palimpsest, new white over old gray over new white again, that preserved information the way archaeological layers preserved artifacts. If you knew how to read it, if you were patient enough. First checkpoint, Hoffman murmured. They had reached the intersection of what the map called Industrial Boulevard and Service Route 7. He raised a fist. The column stopped. Webb activated his passive sensors. Gentry turned to face behind them. Nora looked at the snow. There were tracks. Old ones 48 hours at minimum, based on the degree of wind erosion at the edges. 2 individuals moving east to west, walking in single file, which suggested discipline and training. And then, overlapping those, a different set, newer, a single individual moving north. And then this was the part that stopped her. No corresponding return track. She looked for the return. You always had to look for the return. There was none. Sergeant, she said, hold. She waited until he came alongside her and crouched where she was crouching, following her sight line to the snow. Someone went north, she said. Hasn't come back. Hoffman studied the tracks. He was a good soldier and an experienced one, and he gave the snow the attention it deserved. Then he straightened. Wind could have covered the return, he said. The wind pattern today is from the northwest. If they came back the same way, the return tracks would be sheltered by the original tracks. They'd still show, or they left by a different route. Yes, she said. Or that. He looked at her. She looked at the snow. He moved back to the head of the column. They continued north. The doubt? Marcus Webb was the kind of soldier who talked about his equipment the way other men talked about their children, with a mixture of pride and mild anxiety and the constant low-level fear that something would go wrong when he needed it most. His passive sensor array was check-made, military grade, and capable of detecting thermal signatures through 14 centimeters of concrete. In theory, getting some scatter, he said, studying the small display on his wrist unit. Cold surfaces create bleed-through in the thermal readings. Meaning what? Gentry asked. Meaning the buildings are cold, the air is cold, everything is cold, and the differential we'd normally use to spot a body heat signature is compressed. We'd need someone within about 6 meters to get a clean read. That's not great, Gentry said. No, Webb agreed. It's not. They had taken shelter in the shell of a machine shop to rest, eat, and recalibrate before the second leg of the route. The roof was partially collapsed, but the eastern wall was intact and provided adequate cover from the prevailing wind. Someone had dragged a pair of empty cable reels to the center of the floor, and Hoffman used one as a surface for the physical map, holding it flat with his forearms while he traced the route north with his finger. Nora sat apart from the others, near a broken window, watching the street. She had been doing this for 20 minutes. In that time she had observed the following. The snow on the near side of the intersection drifted consistently from left to right, which matched the prevailing wind. The snow on the far side drifted inconsistently, mostly left to right, with a small section between the pharmacy building and the collapsed awning where it drifted the opposite direction. This was either a building-created eddy, which was common, or it meant something was displacing air at street level in a way that interrupted the prevailing pattern. She was fairly certain it was not an eddy. The geometry was wrong. An eddy required a sufficient structure on the downwind side to create the pressure differential. The pharmacy had no such structure at that corner. Callahan. Hoffman was looking at her. I see something in the drift pattern across the street. she said. Southeast corner of that block. The snow's moving against the wind in a section about 2 meters wide. Webb looked up from his equipment. I'm not reading any heat signature in that area. Their thermal equipment might be suppressed, she said. Or they might be using the ground to... There's nobody there, Gentry said. It wasn't cruel. He was looking at the intersection and he clearly, genuinely could not see anything to justify the conversation. Hoffman walked to the window and stood beside her for a moment, looking where she was looking. What are you actually seeing, Callahan? A disturbance in the drift pattern consistent with a drafty building and 9 months of nobody maintaining the gutters. He was not dismissive about it. He was just being accurate about what the evidence actually showed. Note it, we move in 6 minutes. Nora noted it. She filed it beside the single set of northbound footprints with no return, beside the half-open engine hatch on the delivery truck, beside 3 other small anomalies she had accumulated and not yet shared because they were individually insufficient and collectively only suggestive. She was building something. She didn't know its final shape yet. There was a specific discomfort in this that she had learned to tolerate over years of this kind of work, the discomfort of incomplete pattern recognition, of having data that gestured toward a conclusion without yet arriving at one. Untrained people, in her experience, resolved this discomfort in one of 2 ways. They decided the data meant something specific and committed to that conclusion, or they decided the data meant nothing and dismissed it entirely. Both resolutions felt better than sitting with the ambiguity. Both resolutions were also how you got people killed. She had learned, and the learning had been its own kind of discipline, had required its own long months of uncomfortable practice to hold the data open, to keep it active without collapsing it into a conclusion, to stay in the productive uncertainty and let new data arrive and integrate without forcing the pattern closed before it was ready. The result was that she was often wrong in the moment and right later. This was not how most people wanted to operate. Most people wanted to be right now or not at all. She continued to note anomalies and to wait. The sound that wasn't there. The second rest stop was an 8-story apartment building that had been partially used as a staging area by friendly forces during the initial withdrawal. There were chalk marks on the stairwell walls, unit designations, directional arrows, casualty tallies from 9 months ago, and the ground floor had been stripped of furniture and left with only debris. Hoffman established a perimeter watch rotation. Webb recharged his equipment from a field battery. Gentry ate from a ration pack and tried to sleep with his back against the wall. Nora did not sleep. She sat in the center of the ground floor and listened. This was a practice that snipers sometimes developed, and that was difficult to explain to people who hadn't done it. The deliberate emptying of active attention, the conscious withdrawal of interpretive effort, allowing acoustic data to arrive unfiltered. The brain wanted to categorize sound, wanted to immediately assign it to known sources and dismiss it or flag it. The practice required suspending that reflex. Hearing without identifying, receiving without concluding. The apartment building made sounds. They all did. Thermal expansion and contraction in the frame, wind pressure against the exterior walls, the settling of damage that had been accumulating since the evacuation. She cataloged these and set them aside. And then, at irregular intervals 3 times in 20 minutes, each separated by between 4 and 7 minutes, a sound that did not belong to the building's own movement. Brief, metallic, too small to specify but too consistent to dismiss. A contact sound. Something hard against something harder, transmitted through a medium that was conducting it with slight attenuation, which meant there was material between the source and her ears. Concrete, or compacted soil, or both. She went to Hoffman. There's a sound below us, she said. Metallic, recurring, 3 times in 20 minutes. The attenuation pattern suggests it's coming through the floor, not through the walls. Hoffman had been reading the map. He set it down and gave her his full attention, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him in the 6 hours she'd been working with him. He took information seriously even when he doubted its source. She had worked with 3 other unit leaders before this deployment and had come to understand that this quality, the willingness to take information seriously from someone you hadn't yet decided to trust, was rarer than it should have been in a profession where bad information got people killed. Below us, he repeated. Underground infrastructure in this district. Maintenance tunnels for the industrial pipeline system. They run under the main avenues and connect the factory blocks. He pulled the physical map and found the infrastructure overlay. Studied it for a long moment. Those tunnels would be flooded, he said. The maintenance systems haven't been operational for 9 months. Not all of them. She pointed to a section on the map. This block is on an elevated gradient. The tunnels here would drain to the south. They'd be cold but passable. Webb had been listening. I can recalibrate for subsurface signatures, he said. It'll take 20 minutes. Do it, Hoffman said. And to Nora, show me exactly where you think the sound was coming from. She showed him. He looked at the map again, at the tunnel routing, at the factory blocks above them and the streets between them, and she watched him begin, slowly, to see the shape of what she was seeing. Not all of it, not yet, but the beginning. The acoustic experience she was drawing on was something she had formalized through training but had first encountered in her grandfather's house, a large, old structure with wooden floors and a basement that ran the full length of the foundation, and she had learned as a child that she could hear her grandfather moving in the basement from any room in the house because the floor joists transmitted his footsteps in a characteristic way. The transmission was not perfect. It was attenuated, filtered through layers of material, distorted by the medium, but it was consistent, and consistency was what mattered. Below her now, something moved, something metal-shod, or carrying something metal. The sound came through 16 inches of concrete and packed substrate and the compressed layers of a 9 months disused floor and arrived at her ears as something barely above the threshold of consciousness. But consistently was everything, the decision no one understood. Webb's recalibrated sensor sweep came back inconclusive. The subsurface environment was too thermally uniform to isolate a human signature against the background. Whatever was down there, if anything was down there, was either motionless or dressed in thermal suppression equipment, or both. The sensor couldn't say. Hoffman ordered the column to move. They were 2 blocks north of the apartment building when Nora stopped. The intersection ahead was a wide one, industrial scale, designed for the turning radius of heavy freight vehicles, and therefore open in a way that urban intersections rarely were. The buildings at each corner were set back from the curb. The sightlines were long and unobstructed. In daylight, it would have been a tactically uncomfortable position, the kind of open ground you move through quickly with your head down. In pre-dawn darkness with fresh snowfall, it was quieter and more contained. On the northeast corner, there was a section of wall, the base of what had been a logistics company, now a facade without an interior that projected slightly from the building line. A natural corner, a natural angle, and above it, on the top edge of the projecting section, the snow had drifted in a specific pattern that Nora spent 45 seconds analyzing before she understood what it meant. The drift was layered, recent accumulation over a compressed base. The compression suggested weight, not wind load weight, which produced uniform compression, but point load weight, concentrated at intervals, the kind that a human foot created when someone climbed up and crouched and shifted position. Recently, she stopped walking and raised her rifle. Callahan, Hoffman's voice, clipped. She moved to the nearest cover, a concrete pillar from a collapsed canopy, and settled into her position. The northeast corner of the intersection was in her field of view. She adjusted her scope elevation for the distance. She placed her point of aim 3 inches left of the corner's leading edge. "What are you doing?" Gentry, genuinely confused. 3 more seconds, she said, and then, quieter, mostly to herself, maybe 4. "Command is requesting movement update," Webb said. "We're 6 minutes behind schedule." Callahan, Hoffman again. "There is nothing at that corner." "I know," she said. "Then what?" "Wait," she said. "Please." She heard him exhale through the radio. She heard Gentry shift his weight. She heard Webb's sensor unit emit its low, meaningless pulse. And then she felt, really, more than heard, the almost inaudible compression of snow beneath the surface of the street. Not footsteps. Not exactly. Something traveling below the surface and causing the packed snow above to respond, transmitting force upward through layers of ice and compacted material in the attenuated, distorted way that made it nearly impossible to interpret. Nearly. She exhaled. She did not yet fire. Not yet. The shot with no target. Later, hours later, in the debrief, in the written report, in the quiet conversation that Hoffman had with Nora over bad coffee in a forward operating base, 40 kilometers south, she would try to explain what happened in that specific 2-second window. She would always fail, partially. Not because she didn't understand it, but because the understanding lived in a sensory domain that language approximated poorly. The wind shifted. This was objective and observable. It shifted by approximately 12 degrees off its prevailing direction, which moved the snowfall in the intersection from a consistent southeast diagonal to a briefly vertical fall. This lasted approximately 1.3 seconds. During that 1.3 seconds, the air above the tunnel access point, which was located As she had calculated, beneath a maintenance cover, 40 meters into the intersection was marginally warmer than the surrounding air. Not dramatically, not enough to see without instruments, but enough to affect the snowfall in that specific location in a way that was microscopically different from the fall pattern in adjacent areas. She saw it in her scope, a slight, directional difference in the way the snow crossed the northeast corner's leading edge. Not a person, not a shape, a perturbation the word her brain offered, which was unusual enough to surprise her even in the moment in the data. The perturbation moved toward the corner's edge at a pace consistent with a person moving at speed through a tunnel and arriving at an access point. She fired. The round left the barrel at the moment. The maintenance hatch at the base of the corner began to lift, not visible yet. She was firing slightly before it was visible, firing at the prediction, not the observation, and the figure came out moving fast, committed to momentum, coming around the corner's base and rising into the space her round was already traveling through. The figure dropped. No one spoke. Nora kept her eye on the scope and her point of aim on the corner's edge for 5 more seconds, in case there was a second figure. There wasn't. She stood up. Her hands were steady. This was something she had once been asked about in a training evaluation, whether she experienced stress response at the moment of engagement, whether the physical symptoms of adrenaline affected her precision, and she had answered honestly, yes, always. The heart rate elevated, the peripheral vision narrowed, the breath wanted to shorten. These were normal responses, and she had spent years learning to work with them rather than against them, to let the adrenaline sharpen her attention without allowing it to rush her, to breathe through the elevation and use its clarity without surrendering her patience. The result was that her hands were steady and the target was down and the corner was empty again, and she felt, as she always felt at this specific moment, a complex and inadequately nameable thing, not satisfaction, exactly, but a resolution, a closing of the probability space. The world had been uncertain, it was now less so. She had made a claim about the future 3 seconds, she had said, and the future had confirmed it. This was not triumph. She was not interested in triumph. It was simply the data closing, the loop completing. She walked toward the intersection. Behind her, she heard Gentry say, very quietly, to no one in particular, what just happened. It was not a question. What the body told them. The figure was a man, late 30s, heavily built beneath the layers of equipment he was wearing, which were sophisticated enough that Marcus Webb spent 4 minutes just cataloging them and whistling softly to himself at intervals. Adaptive thermal suppression suit, he said. Military grade. This isn't off-the-shelf equipment. He held up the fabric near the collar, where a small mechanism was embedded. Phase change material. It cycles through temperatures to prevent the suit surface from maintaining a consistent thermal signature. Your sensor reads it as ambient, not human, which is why your equipment didn't see him, Hoffman said. It was not quite an apology. It was the acknowledgement of an error in a system he'd trusted, which is why my equipment didn't see him, Webb agreed. He did not seem offended. He seemed fascinated. The maintenance hatch was set into the base of the corner wall, a steel plate with a recessed handle, painted to match the concrete, and then partially covered by accumulated grime that would have taken months to accumulate naturally. This meant it had been in use long enough that the camouflage was aged. This was not a recent operation. Hoffman looked at the hatch and at Nora and at the hatch again. Show me your reasoning, he said. She went through it. The footprints with no return. The anomalous drift pattern across from the machine shop. The metallic sound below the apartment building floor. The weighted compression in the snow above the corner wall ledge. The thermal perturbation in the snowfall during the brief wind shift. She did not say, I had a feeling. She did not say, something told me. She said, the data indicated. She said, the pattern was consistent with. She said, the probability was high enough to justify the decision. You were firing at a person who wasn't there yet, Gentry said. He was not challenging her. He was working through it. I was firing at the space where the data indicated a person was going to be, she said. Predictive engagement. It's not, she paused. It's not unusual in precision work. You account for bullet travel time, for target movement velocity. I just extended the time frame of the prediction by about 3 seconds. By about 3 seconds, she agreed. Gentry looked at the hatch, at the tunnel beyond it, at the dead man in the thermal suppression suit. He seemed to be conducting some kind of internal inventory, cataloging what he thought he knew about his profession and comparing it against what he had just witnessed, and finding that the comparison required him to update several things. She recognized this process. She had been through versions of it herself. In the early years, when she had first encountered people who were doing the work at a level that redefined what she thought the work could be, it was not a comfortable process. It was a necessary one. Hoffman was still looking at the hatch, then at the tunnel beyond it, the dark throat leading down into the infrastructure beneath the city, then at his map. "How many of these tunnel access points are there in this district?" he asked. Webb was already ahead of him, counting on the overlay. He looked up. His expression said the answer before he said it. 31, he said. "Between here and the northern supply route. The hunters become the hunted." The call to command took 4 minutes. The news it returned with took 30 seconds to hear and changed the operational picture entirely. 2 other reconnaissance units, one from the regiment's eastern element, one from an attached intelligence team, had entered Veltmar in the last 6 hours. Neither had reported contact. Neither was responding to radio now. "They've been using the tunnels to surveil us," Hoffman said. He said it the way you say something when you are confirming what you already suspected rather than discovering something new. "They've been watching every unit that enters the city, mapping our routes, identifying patrol patterns, and then waiting," Nora said. She was looking at the tunnel map Webb had overlaid on his display. She was counting access points and measuring distances and running geometry she didn't yet have a conclusion for. "They're not using the tunnels to ambush. They're using them to position." Position for what? She looked at the map, at the supply route to the north, at the network of tunnels spreading beneath the city like root systems, connecting every major intersection, running beneath every primary avenue. She looked at the maintenance access points and their spacing and their locations relative to the street-level positions a surveillance element would need to effectively monitor movement. She looked at the corner where the man had died. He had not been moving toward them. He had been moving away north, toward the supply route, moving with purpose and speed, which meant he was carrying something. Information, possibly a report, possibly coordinates. "They're positioning for a coordinated action," she said. "They've been watching long enough to know where we go and when. This man was a messenger, which means someone is waiting for his message." Hoffman's face went through several things in rapid succession. "We're inside their observation perimeter," he said. "We have been since we entered the city," she said. "Probably. Then they know where we are right now." "Yes, and they have 31 access points." 30, she said. "We know one of them." Gentry had been listening. He had his rifle up now, scanning the street methodically, and his expression had changed from the young man who'd wanted to laugh an hour ago into something older and more careful. "So what do we do?" Hoffman looked at Nora. It was a specific kind of look, the look of a man who has run out of the kind of experience that applies, and is identifying the kind of experience that does. "Callahan," he said, "this is your expertise now." She thought about the weight of this, not the tactical question. She had already begun processing that, but the particular quality of what Hoffman had just done. A man with 10 years of operational seniority over her, in a life or death situation, choosing to hand operational lead to someone he'd worked with for 6 hours because he understood that experience was domain-specific and the domain had changed. She had worked with leaders who couldn't have done this, who would have held command through pride, through habit, through the inability to distinguish between being in charge and being right. In her experience, that distinction, the gap between authority and competence, was where most of the preventable casualties happened. "We don't fight the tunnels," she said. "We read the network from above and route around it. We stay in the alleys, reduce exposure to access points, and we find the command position if there's coordination happening. There's a hub, and if we remove the hub, the network loses coherence. Individual elements won't know where we are without the coordinator." Hoffman was already looking at the map. "Time? Less than an hour to extraction window. It's tight. Then we don't waste any." The counterattack in silence. "Stop looking with your eyes," Nora said. They were crouched at the entry of a service alley between 2 factory blocks, and she was explaining something that she had never had to explain before, because it was not the kind of thing she usually had to teach. But she explained it clearly and without apology for its strangeness, and she watched the 3 of them absorb it. "They're below us. We won't see them. We won't hear them in any normal way, so we stop trying to see or hear them the normal way. We read the environment, the snow, the drift, the temperature differential at access points. We read the wind." "What do we do when we identify a point?" Hoffman asked. "We don't go near it. We triangulate. Each active access point creates a pattern, a small thermal plume if we're lucky, a drift anomaly at minimum. If we identify 2 or 3, we can map the tunnel section they're using. If we can map the section, we can predict where they're concentrated. And then we don't fight them. We move around them. We find the section with no activity and we route through it. Move around them, Gentry repeated. We're 4 people, she said. We don't win a fight against an unknown number of contacts using terrain they know better than we do. We get out of the city with the intelligence we have and let people with better resources make decisions with it. Hoffman nodded. Clean. No argument. Lead, he said. What followed was 40 minutes of the most demanding attention she had ever paid to a physical environment. She moved them by wind, not by sight. When she wanted to know what was happening on the next block, she didn't look around the corner. She watched the snow on the corner's surface and measured its drift against the prevailing direction and noted the discrepancies. She moved them toward calm air and away from disturbed air. She moved them toward consistent drift and away from anomaly. Twice, she stopped the column in the middle of an open street and held it absolutely still for 90 seconds while she watched the snow behavior near a maintenance cover 30 meters to their west. Both times, the cover showed the sign's slight differential drift, a trace of warmth in the snow immediately adjacent, and both times she moved the column east instead, away from the access point, adding 40 meters to their route but keeping them clear. She fired twice more during those 40 minutes. The first time was at an access point she had identified, but that was too close to their route to avoid. She placed her point of aim at the predicted emergence angle and held it while the column moved behind her, and as the last member cleared the exposure zone, the cover began to lift and she fired at the lift and the cover fell back. No figure emerged. She did not know whether she had hit someone below the surface who had been preparing to emerge, or whether the figure below had registered the shot and chosen to hold. Either outcome served her purpose. They moved. The second time was at a figure she saw in a window on the 3rd floor of an office building, not from a tunnel, which surprised her and told her the tunnel network wasn't the only layer of their surveillance infrastructure. The figure had a rifle with a thermal scope and was tracking Hoffman. She fired at the same moment the figure began to apply pressure to his trigger, and the sequence was different from the first shot in one important way. She saw the target before she fired. It was, she admitted to herself, somewhat easier. Gentry came up beside her as they cleared the exposure zone of the office building. He didn't say anything. He was running the kind of focused, processing, quiet that she recognized as someone updating their understanding of a situation significantly. She gave him time. You're reading the city like a map, he said finally, not a question. The city is a map, she said. Everything that's happened in it left a mark. You just have to know which marks to read and which to ignore. He absorbed this. Then, how do you know which to ignore? Practice. She paused. And being wrong a lot, at first, and paying attention to why you were wrong. Don't stop, she said. They didn't. The other sniper. She found the control center by its absence. This was the most counterintuitive thing she would ever try to explain to anyone who hadn't done it. When you were looking for a sniper position, you looked for the places where environmental data went quiet, where the snow was uniformly undisturbed, where the wind moved without deviation, where everything was exactly what it should be in a space where nobody was, and was therefore suspicious precisely because of its perfection. A sniper who knew their work covered their position so well that they created a kind of negative space, an absence that was itself a presence, for anyone trained to feel it. She had been trained to feel it. The building was a district administrative center, 4 stories, flat roof, commanding sightlines in 3 directions. The windows were intact, which was unusual in a city that had taken 9 months of weather and occasional structural stress. They were intact because someone had been careful about them. She could see, from her current angle 300 meters south, that the ground floor windows had been cleaned. Not obviously, just enough to make looking through them possible. She told Hoffman to hold the column. There's a command position in that building, she said. Senior. Probably the communications hub for the tunnel network. Can you reach it from here? I can reach the building. I need to find the position within it. How long? I don't know. He accepted that. We'll hold. She spent 11 minutes watching the building. Not the windows, she had already cataloged the windows. She watched the roof, specifically the northeastern parapet, which was the position she would have chosen if she were using that building because it commanded the maximum sightline to the south while offering shadow concealment from the east pre-dawn light. She was looking for the same thing she always looked for, the absence, the negative space in the snow on the parapet, where someone had been lying, then shifted, then lain again, over a period of hours that compressed the snow in a specific pattern. Not uniform, a person could not maintain a single position for hours without micro-movement, without the small shifts of weight and blood flow and cold cramped muscle. The pattern of those movements was written in the snow if you knew how to read it. She found it. 3rd meter from the northeast corner of the parapet, a concentrated compression zone with the specific irregular patterning of a person who had been prone for a long time and was very disciplined but was not, in the end, entirely motionless. Nobody ever was. She was 320 meters away. The wind at this distance was a variable she had already been calculating for the last hour of movement, cross-referencing her felt observation of snow drift at multiple points with the meteorological data her unit had briefed. She had a number in her head, a wind call accurate enough for this distance and this stillness, and she adjusted her elevation and drift without taking her eye off the scope. She understood that she was now in a different kind of engagement than anything she had done in the city so far. Everything before had been asymmetric. She had information the targets did not. She had identified them before they identified her. She had fired from concealment into uncertainty, and the uncertainty had resolved in her favor. This was different. This person on the parapet was a sniper. They had been there for hours, which meant they had patience. They had a command position, which meant they had intelligence about what was moving through the city, and they had survived this long, which meant they were competent. They were not, however, looking for her. That was the remaining asymmetry, and it was the one she had to use before it disappeared. She watched the micro-movement on the parapet. The figure was tracking Hoffman's column, which was 200 meters to the northwest. The tracking motion was smooth and controlled, not the jerky, reactive tracking of an amateur following movement, but the practiced, fluid lead and hold of someone who had done this for a long time. They were estimating velocity, computing lead, preparing a firing solution. She had less time than she would have liked. She found her point of aim in the compressed snow of the parapet, not the figure itself, which she could not fully resolve at this distance in these conditions, but the center of the disturbance they had created, the centroid of the negative space their presence had made in the snow. She placed her reticle on that point and made her final adjustments. The figure's tracking motion paused. They had their lead. They were about to fire. She was about to fire. She fired. By how much she beat them, a quarter second? Perhaps she did not know exactly. She heard her own shot and did not hear theirs, and that was enough. She worked the bolt. Watched the parapet for a long count of 10. Nothing moved. Clear, she said into the radio. The final silence. They reached the southern extraction point at 0627 hours, 17 minutes before first light. The pickup vehicle was exactly where it was supposed to be, and the driver was exactly who he was supposed to be, and when the 4 of them climbed in and the doors closed and the vehicle began to move south through the still dark landscape outside Veltmar, no one said anything for almost a full minute. Gentry broke it. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to be clear that I'm saying it completely sincerely and not in any way that suggests I'm questioning your methods or your decision-making or your—" "Owen," Hoffman said, "the fact that you shot a man who wasn't there yet is the most alarming thing I have ever personally witnessed." Gentry finished. "And I've been in country for 7 weeks." Nora looked at him. In the dark interior of the vehicle, her face was hard to read. "I didn't shoot a man who wasn't there," she said. "I shot a man who was definitely there. He was below me in a tunnel, moving toward an access point. I identified his trajectory and his velocity, and I put a round at the intersection of his path and the surface. Before he came up, Gentry thought about this. Is there a name for that? Predictive engagement, she said. Some people call it pre-fire. She paused. It's not common. No, he said. I imagine not. Hoffman had not participated in this conversation. He was looking at the road ahead, at the dark fields on either side of the highway that connected the city to the rear area. At the first gray beginning of dawn at the horizon's edge, he had a look Nora had seen on experienced soldiers, sometimes the look of someone updating a model, revising an assumption that had quietly structured how they saw things, consistent with a weather event and 9 months of nobody maintaining the roof drainage, he said, completing the thought. Yes. I know, you couldn't have known. The individual anomalies didn't add up to a conclusion, they added up to a possibility. You made the right call at each decision point with the information you had. I didn't see the tunnel network. No one did. Their concealment was very good. It was only visible as an aggregate pattern across a long observation window, and the only reason I had that window was because I'd been accumulating data since we entered the city. She paused. I'd been doing it quietly, because presenting inconclusive data to someone who hasn't asked for it tends to create noise rather than signal. I should have been more forthcoming. He shook his head. You presented what you had when you had enough to present. That's not a failure. She accepted this. It was accurate enough. What did you see? Hoffman asked. At the very end, before you fired the first time, she thought about how to answer this honestly. Nothing, she said. That's the honest answer. I saw nothing. No person, no movement, no target. I saw the environment around where the person was, and I saw how it was behaving, and the behavior was inconsistent with a world in which the person didn't exist there. So you fired at a nothing. I fired at the nothing that had a person in it, she said, which is different from firing at a nothing that doesn't. The vehicle moved through the dawn. The city fell away behind them, its dark silhouette against the lightning sky gradually losing definition until it was indistinguishable from the other shapes of the winter landscape, just another collection of structures, just another arrangement of mass against the horizon. From the outside, it looked like nothing at all. 3 weeks later, Nora received a written evaluation from the division's long-range precision assessment panel. It was a standardized form, mostly checkboxes and numerical ratings on a scale from 1 to 5. At the bottom, there was a section for written comments, and the evaluating officer had written, exceptional spatial intelligence, unusual predictive modeling capability in low visibility environments, recommend for advanced reconnaissance integration. She read it once and filed it in the folder where she kept that category of documents. The assessment panel's language was the language of institutional recognition, measured, formal, designed to quantify something that resisted quantification. What it was trying to describe, she understood, was not a skill in the conventional sense. It was an orientation toward the world, a willingness to receive information without immediately processing it into meaning, a tolerance for the uncomfortable space between data and conclusion. She did not think of it as exceptional. She thought of it as the result of a great many early mornings in northern Minnesota, in the cold, with an old man who had very little formal education and a remarkable sensitivity to the world around him, who had understood without being able to articulate it that the universe was always communicating and that the main obstacle to receiving its communications was the noise of your own assumptions. The more significant thing was the note she received from Sergeant Dale Hoffman. It was handwritten, on a small piece of paper folded twice. It said, I've been going back through every patrol briefing from the last 6 months and looking at the anomalies that got marked inconclusive. I've found 4. I don't know what to do with them yet. I'd like your opinion. He wrote back, I'll look at them. Send the reports. She did not hear from Owen Gentry directly, but through the informal network by which information moved through a military formation, she heard that he had started doing something in his off hours that none of his bunkmates could explain. He would sit somewhere with his eyes closed and just listen. Not listening to anything specific, just listening. When they asked him what he was doing, he said he was learning to read a language. None of them understood what he meant. She understood exactly. There is a version of expertise that announces itself. The expert who holds court, who explains, who performs their knowledge for the benefit of onlookers. This is a legitimate version. It has its purposes and its pleasures. And then there is the other version, the one that sits very still in an abandoned city in the dark and listens to sounds that aren't there yet and fires at corners that are still empty and does not need you to understand why, because understanding is not the point. The point is that, 3 seconds later, the corner is no longer empty, and the round is already there, and the enemy who thought they were invisible learns in the last moment available for learning that invisibility is never absolute, that the world is always writing itself, that someone is always reading it,